Hello and welcome to this episode of CV Remote Solutions Master Series, where we've addressed the gaps and barriers in device clinic care for patients with implanted cardiac devices. In this episode, we will answer key questions around knowing your data. I'm Dr. James Allred, electrophysiologist and co-founder of CV Remote Solutions. Today, we're joined by Amber Seiler, electrophysiology nurse practitioner and co-founder of CV Remote Solutions. Welcome. We're looking forward to learning from you today.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. We're excited about this series and excited about sharing knowledge that we have gathered over the years around device clinic management and hoping that this is a really big asset to your clinic as you think about device clinic management and the tools you need to make your device clinic really successful.
So this is the first episode in the series, and you've specifically chosen data as a place to focus. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. When we think about data within our device clinics, there's so many possibilities and so many ways we can go in to explore that data. And I think that it's important always to think about our patients first and the data that comes to us from their devices and how it helps us to manage their care. But in this episode, we're specifically focused on taking a step back and looking at the data that comprises your whole device clinic and how do you look from a 10,000 foot view at all the information coming into your device clinic and use that information strategically to help you plan staffing, evaluate opportunities, and look for ways to improve the care of your patients through more efficient management of their data.
So when you think about this data, what comes to mind? What data is most important for clinicians to know when they're taking the first step in this process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think first thing that we should always know is how many device patients are we following? And that seems like a really easy question to answer, but it's a really difficult one for device clinics to have an accurate number for. There are a lot of reasons for that. Patients are disconnected, they're lost to follow-up, patients are deceased, or they transfer out of our clinic. And it takes a lot of intentional time and effort to make sure that we have an accurate patient list. But without that accurate patient list first, we really can't go anywhere else with looking at staffing models or managing patients or how many resources we need to take really good care of our patients. So that's number one, how many patients do you follow? The second one that I think is incredibly important is what is your remote compliance? Again, a very difficult number to get to for most of our device clinics that we work with. For all of those same reasons. If you don't have an accurate patient count, it's really difficult to do an accurate calculation on remote compliance. And so thinking about compliance, it's not only how many patients are transmitting, but how many patients are transmitting every time you tell them to, and are we taking advantage of the revenue streams that we have to come into our device clinic to fund things like our staffing and projects for our patients to better improve their care. And then the third data piece that I think is really important is how much non-actionable work is coming into your clinic. And if the first two were hard, this one's really difficult, but it's so worth the work to figure it out. Non-actionable work or non-billable transmissions that come into our clinic oftentimes are really important. So things like alerts with a lead fracture or newly diagnosed AFib. And those things are incredibly important for us to take care of our patients, intervene on them, make sure they have really good patient outcomes. But we all know there's also lots of transmissions that come in that are not value add. Things like excessive manual transmissions, redundant non-actionable alerts, and the list goes on and on. Knowing that percentage of non-billable work that your clinic's managing every month allows you to target those groups of patients that you might be able to intervene on and decrease that number so that we can better take care of the data that is actionable that's coming into our clinics more timely.
Fantastic. So let's take each of these three. So the first one you said is to know how many patients you're following. So how would a clinic staff person, how would a physician, how would an administrator get that information?
Yeah, so getting the information is a little bit tricky and depends on what systems you have in place. So most of us have a device database, some type of device database. If you have a device database, you should be able to pull an active patient list. Keeping in mind that list might not be completely accurate for all of the reasons that we mentioned before, and that it takes intentional work and effort to keep that list updated with patients deceased removed, transferred patients removed, working that lost to follow-up list, all of those things. But the device database is the place to go. If you have a device database that isn't capable of pulling an active patient list, we might should look honestly at a different device database. It's one of the most basic fundamental things that we need in our device clinics is to be able to know how many patients we're following and who they are. The other way to go find this number is to look at your remote monitoring website. So pull up CareLink, pull up Merlin, Latitude, Biotronic. Look at those patients that are transmitting, and that's a big distinction. It's not just patients that are enrolled, but it's patients that are transmitting. And so for clinics without a device database, this is kind of where we start. And I say look at any patient that's had a transmission in the last 2 years. We can assume that those are the ones that are most likely to still be actively followed by your clinic, and that's a reasonable place to start to get a good number. The last place, and if neither one of those work, and one that's a little bit, a lot of bit more cumbersome, is asking your EMR folks to pull for you a list of patients that have had billed device check codes in the last year or two. That often takes a lot of time, a lot of conversations to help them understand why it's important, and I would probably use that as a last resort, but it's one that you could use if the other two don't work for you.
You know, I think it's essential to know how many devices you're following, and as we visit clinics around the country, it's amazing at how few actually do. If you meet with a practice administrator and you say, well, how many patients are in your Coumadin clinic, he can tell you immediately how many patients, what that follow through is and all these things, but then you follow that with, well, how many device clinic patients do you have? And often you get a blank look, but it's a very important thing. So I think following your direction and being able to identify exactly how many patients you're following is important. And then I think the next thing you said was knowing your compliance. Okay, so how do we figure that out?
Again, if you've got a device database, that's a big first step. Most device databases now can pull for you billable remotes versus non-billable remotes, and then can run those calculations. You know, the easiest thing to do is to take your active patient list, your number of pacemakers, ICDs, loop recorders. Pacemakers and ICD patients, you're going to multiply that by 4. We should be doing a remote check every 91 days for those patients around the calendar year. Your loop recorder patients, multiply that by 12. We should be doing a check every 31 days around the calendar year. And then figure out if you're doing heart failure monitoring or not, and if so, we should add in that volume. Most of our ICD patients are heart failure compatible. Whenever we look at a device clinic and do an evaluation, however, we normally attribute 40% of ICD patients to heart failure monitoring. Not everyone is appropriate, not everyone needs, more intensive follow-up, but you can about guarantee 40% of your TACI patients would qualify for some sort of more intensive heart failure monitoring, and there's a lot of value there, and perhaps we'll talk about that on a later episode. But then you get those number of checks you should be doing in a year, and then you look at how many bill checks you actually did in the last year, and then you just divide those numbers and it'll give you the percentage of compliance that you're at. If you need any help doing that, we've got calculators built and are happy to help you pull that data and run that data. I don't want anybody to get discouraged whenever you pull these numbers and look at them for yourself. My guess is that you think you're doing amazing and everybody's working incredibly hard, and your compliance won't be where you think it is, and that's okay. And so but the first step in a journey is where you start. And so we can't get better until we know where we are. And so that's the first thing to do, is to figure out what current compliance is, and then set a realistic goal for your clinic and then a path to get there.
I suspect you've literally done this with hundreds of clinics. What would you say compliance is nationally, just based on your experience with a lot of different clinics?
Yeah, it's a good question. So most of the clinics that we look at, compliance is around 35 to 40% for remotes. And again, not because people aren't working incredibly hard. Everybody's working really hard. There's just a lot of inefficiencies in what we do, a lot of difficulty in capturing this information, making sure that patients remain on cadence, and the amount of work it takes to continue to keep patients connected and transmitting. And so again, don't be discouraged. Also, don't set your goal for 100%. It is not going to happen, right? And so whenever we look at clinics, we say we run a couple of numbers and a couple of projections. We run what 80% compliance would look like, and then we run what 90% compliance would look like. But getting between 80 and 90% compliant should be a reasonable goal.
Okay, so know how many patients you're following and know what your compliance is. And then the third thing that you mentioned was just non-actionable work, or how much additional work that your team might be doing.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. How do we figure that out?
This is hard, and it's one that's a little bit off the radar for most of our clinics, but it's really important. So I want you to think about Miss Smith. Miss Smith's got a pacemaker, she's got AFib, and we know she has AFib. And somebody's got Miss Smith's AFib alert on to trigger for every hour in 24 hours of AFib that she has. And so every day, you're getting an alert from Miss Smith. And maybe you read today, and Lindsay reads tomorrow, and Tori reads Wednesday. And so you don't realize that all of these transmissions are coming in that are redundant, that we're not doing a thing about. But what's going to happen is that eventually Miss Smith's going to have something really wrong with her device, and everybody's going to know her name because we've seen her name every single day. But we potentially are going to miss it because we've just kind of become numb to Miss Smith because she has alerts every single day. It takes time to review all of those transmissions. It's not good patient care to get alerts for things that we know about that aren't clinically actionable. We're taking away from patients actually who do need that advanced level of care, who we could do something about their actionable transmissions. And so being able to identify those patients who have frequent transmissions, knowing how much non-billable work is coming into your clinic every day is really important. The way that we do that is we take how many transmissions were processed versus how many were billed, and then that's how we get that percentage. If your percentage is anywhere over 40%, we got some work to do. You know, we really need to dig in and figure out why are those transmissions coming in, and how do we decrease them so that we can better take care of the patients who, again, have actionable events or have scheduled remote transmissions that have kind of just been put on the back burner, or we're trying to get through these unscheduled remotes.
Awesome. So again, number of patients you're following, compliance, and then with that also non-actionable work.
Yep.
And you said that your team at CV Remote Solutions can help. You've kind of given us the steps to do it, but if it's still something that folks are struggling with or want help with, that's something that your team would help out with.
Yep, absolutely. We have a free evaluation that we offer. Absolutely no risk, no obligation, no nothing. Just, you know, at the end of the day, we want to take really good care of patients, and we want to help people take really good care of patients. And we recognize that we've got some experiences that other people might not have, and our hope is to lend that knowledge to help you make your device clinic better. And so if you want us to run those numbers, you know, what is compliance? What do things look like? How much staff do I need to manage my clinic? What would adding heart failure monitoring look like from a revenue and a resource requirement standpoint? We'd be happy to help you run that. Again, it's a free evaluation, so don't hesitate to reach out if that's something we can help with.
And then how do you use this information once you have it? Tell me about the value. You talked about Ms. Smith and
Yep.
non-actionable work. Knowing that you have so much non-actionable work would maybe cause you to put together some protocols or some things in your clinic to reduce that alert burden to help her out specifically. But what are other ways that you find value in knowing data?
Yeah, it's so important. And I think you hit on a really important one. It's how do we identify the work that's coming in and then figure out what we can do to make our clinics more efficient. And so a lot of that is protocols and pathways, and we've got a specific episode in this series that's going to talk about alert management and what is our approach to that, and how do we think about things, and how do we reduce non-actionable alerts. But another really big part of this is staff planning. The Time and Motion study came out in 2021. Really filled a data gap that had existed in our space and for our clinics, thinking about how many staff do we need to manage these patients. And that work had been done by Betty Ching a couple of decades ago, but not repeated since. And man, have things changed in 20 years. And so our hope is that study allows us to take some real data around how much time it takes to manage these patients and do staff planning so that we know how many resources we then need to manage these patients. And so I think for me, that's the biggest thing. It's giving clinics a little bit of ammunition whenever they go and ask for resources, is say, look, this is how many patients we have, this is how much time it takes to manage them, and therefore we need this many staff.
Very good. And then I imagine once you have baseline data, that's something that you can use to track and to trend and to see hopefully success and improvement over time.
This is a big deal, guys. Nobody is going to toot your own horn for you, right? And nobody's going to keep track of your successes, and nobody's going to do that. Everybody's going to go, yeah, she's pretty good, you know, and that clinic's running pretty well. But it's on us to record that and track it and figure it out. And so I would encourage everybody, know where you start, keep track of all the things that you put in place to make things better. If it's compliance, if it's reduction in non-actionable work, if it's getting that disconnected monitor list finally cleaned up so that you don't have to look at 500 patients on there anymore. But be able to track that over time, it all translates to revenue, which again gives you a little bit of ammunition to go and say, you know, we need some more help, because at the end of the day, it is not about making money, and it is not, but it is about taking really good care of patients. And we can't take care of patients unless we've got the revenue to pay the staff to do it. And so that's how I would encourage people to think about the journey in their clinic and how they can use that information to help manage resources and conversations with administration and conversations with physicians.
Thank you, Amber Seiler, for sharing your expertise, your enthusiasm, and your best practices on mastering your data. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.